The maiden South African Food Security Index 2024, commissioned by food retailer the Shoprite Group, suggests that food security has reached its lowest point in the past 10 years. Developed by economists from the University of Stellenbosch, the index evaluates 4 dimensions, namely availability of food, access to it, utilization of it, and overall stability. It's a study that spans from 2012 to 2023. The gauge is said to have been at its peak at 64.9 points in 2019 and then dropping to 45.3 points in 2023. A reading of 0 would indicate no food security at all. Well, to unpack the story behind these numbers, I'm joined by Professor Dieter von Fintel. He's from the University of Stellenbosch. Thank you very much, Prof, for joining us. So the index you've created is telling us that food insecurity has risen, and I suppose that's not much of a surprise, as we've been hearing and talking about the rising cost of living for some time now. But of course, South Africa has its own unique issues. So what were the key takeaways to come from the index?
Yes, so thank you very much. Of course, it's very problematic for us that food security is at such a low. We saw particularly that in the past it's always related to droughts. Currently, we've got a double issue. We're still in the throes of El Nino. And we also have the external pressures coming from the international markets, that food availability is a problem from the international markets. And this is also because of geopolitical and climate change pressures. Combined, this means that availability is a real problem. There is constraints, and it means that food costs more. It just means it's more difficult for people to afford food. It contributes to increasing hunger rates. And importantly for us, I think, is that what it does is it means that people are changing their budgets so that they use cheaper foods.
Yes.
And they're buying cheaper foods. And those cheaper foods mean that they're less nutritious. And this has long-run consequences for people's nutritional status.
Yeah. Professor, what's your reading of how resilient South Africa's agricultural sector has been to provide the bare minimum to the South African market, even, like you say, when it's been lashed by climate impacts and animal disease and so on?
So what we see is in the statistics is that the production levels have come down because of the drought. In some periods, imports can compensate for this. So in that sense, there are ways to deal with this. But the important thing to notice is that we actually, if we look at just the average food, we actually have enough to feed our population. One of the bigger constraints is also being able to get that food from the field into the plates. And this is the reason why so many South Africans still do go hungry. About 1 in 10 households experience hunger at some point. And the problem with that is that there is enough availability, but the poorest of households are really the people to face the most constraints to be able to get into, to be able to access the food that's on the market.
Yeah. Professor, it's concerning that one of the things that you noted was that child hunger and the stunting of growth has become quite an issue, which of course has major implications for people's prospects to grow up as fully fledged adults.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we're particularly concerned about stunting. South Africa, about 1 in 4 children are stunted. Which means they're too short for their age. But it's not just a physical thing. Stunting often predicts what happens into the future. It's a good proxy for nutritional status. In other words, do children have the right diets and nutrition to be able to perform at school and to be able to eventually get a good job? This has really long-run consequences to have the right basket of nutrition and the right types of foods, especially very early in life. So I think one of the crucial aspects is what we know of as the first 1,000 days from conception to 2 years old, where very young people really need the right nutrition to be able to succeed in life, in future even. Yes.
Professor, one last thing. Of course, there are huge debates raging about whether our grant system is sufficient, particularly when it comes to things like the child grant, you know, in terms of whether it's sufficient to be able to afford basics, you know, like food. Do you think that there are any policy interventions that need to be made? Of course, everything has a cost.
Yes, the grant system, we saw historically that it correlates very strongly to reductions in hunger, which were very high in the early 2000s. And they correlate very strongly, especially in rural areas, with the reductions in hunger. So they do have a way to reducing hunger, but they don't eliminate hunger. If you think of a grant as not being enough to buy a nutritious basket of food, they most certainly aren't enough to also give nutritious food, which is generally more expensive. So what one could do is, especially if we want to focus on the first 1,000 days, is we could think of aspects of school feeding programs which currently target older children. How can we target younger children? One of the first things one could think of doing is looking at early childhood development facilities and thinking of feeding programs there. And the other thing is looking at a key basket of very highly nutritious foods, which are cheap enough for poorer households to afford, to think of the discussions around zero rating and being able to make these nutritious foods also more affordable, not just other foods in general.
Okay. Professor Dieter von Fintel from the University of Stellenbosch, thank you so much, sir, for your time and insights there.